Welcome everybody to the IF20 Human Trafficking webinars. Today we're talking about fast fashion, the apparel industry in general, and modern slavery and the treatment of workers. I'm joined by three great activists in this area. Aisha Barenblatt. Aisha is a social entrepreneur with a passion for building sustainable supply chains. She founded Remake to mobilize citizens to demand a more just, transparent, and accountable fashion industry. Remake's free educational resources, advocacy campaigns, and sustainable brands directory are focused on making fashion a force for good. Aisha has worked across the public, private, and civil society sectors to promote the rights and dignity of the women who make our clothes. Prior to founding Remake, she led brand engagement at Better Work, a World Bank and United Nations partnership, and before that, she ran the fashion vertical at BSR, providing strategic advice to brands including Levi Strauss and Company, Marks & Spencer's, Nike, and Gucci Group. Secondly, joined by Maxine Beda. Maxine is the founder and director of the New Standard Institute, a think tank, and using data to drive accountability in the fashion industry. She is also the author of the book Unraveled, The Life and Death of a Garment, a Financial Times Book of the Year and translated into various languages. Maxine co-founded and was the CEO of Zaddy, a fashion brand and lifestyle destination, creating a transparent and sustainable future for the apparel industry. Maxine has been recognized by Fast Company in its most creative in business. Maxine began her career as an international lawyer working at the Rwandan Criminal Tribunal and at Allen & Overy, and received a Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School. Finally, by Sheila Aluwala. If I pronounced that right, Sheila? Sorry. Sheila is the Director of Policy Advocacy at Transparentum, leading efforts to pursue accountability and achieve systems change in human and environmental rights, particularly forced labor. Previously at the US Department of State for nearly a decade across policy initiatives in Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East, in the department's Office to Combat and Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and she advised senior-level US officials and produced country assessments for the annual Trafficking in Persons report, the JTIP report, for those who are more familiar with that name. She also negotiated human rights resolutions in the UN General Assembly and Human Rights Council, and managed almost 10 million in foreign assistance to promote justice in West Africa. Previously, Sheila worked for the World Bank, the US Department of Labor, and Indigenous Rights Organization in Ecuador. For those who are listening who aren't so familiar with the apparel industry, I'm a big fan of all three of these women. They've done some amazing work, and you need to follow what they're doing. What I'm going to do, as we've done before on the fishing industry, is try and help people place what is happening in the apparel industry. And as before, the speakers are free to interrupt me as I do this, so that we can get their thoughts on this. So these are the essentials of what I think is happening in the apparel industry, and then we'll get the thoughts from the speakers as we go along. So the first of all is there is massive overproduction. The top left is the Atacama Desert, just piles of used clothes. Right is in Ghana. Ghana is, if you don't know, is a big dumping ground for used apparel. And then at the left is Cambodia, where there are massive garbage sites. And something that most people don't know, who don't concentrate on this, is that the used apparel, the wasted apparel, is now being used as a source of fuel, which has a massive environmental impact as well. And we're going to talk about the environmental aspects of this, because you can't talk about one without talking about the other. This is a problem of overproduction and also obviously of overselling. In relation to the treatment of workers, this has been a long-standing problem. I actually grew up in the north of England, which I guess is the sort of ground zero for the labor problems in the garment industry. I grew up near Bradford, where the wool industry began and was extremely successful. And even when I was a child, there were pictures in museums in the 20th century of children working in mills, working on looms and clearing out the textiles. So this is a problem that has been systemic to this industry, in particular in the 20th century, when we started to get much more mass production. That became an even bigger problem, and it was just amplified. Examples are the effort of the Khan campaign to reduce forced labor in Uzbekistan, ongoing efforts by the Clean Clothes campaign across the world. Something we'll ask Aish to talk about, which is what happened in COVID, which was that brands realized they weren't going to have the same level of demand, and they simply just stopped paying people and reneged on contracts that were due, which meant that livelihoods were threatened in the millions. And then an event that did cause some response was the collapse of the building Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. And that cost the lives of over a thousand workers and injured several thousand, as an example of an event where there was simply a lack of investment in the workers' conditions. Any thoughts, the three of you, on any of those things?
I mean, one of the things I'd say, Duncan, is, a lot of the examples you've given is when terrible things happen, we get the industry to take some accountability. I often think, how many people had to die in Rana Plaza? How long did that image have to stay in newspapers for us to get that one binding agreement, which is the North Star of progress we've made in 30 years? And similarly with COVID, at a time when the world was in crisis, it took a lot of campaigning for brands to do the most basic things. And so I think often what you end up seeing beyond crisis is that we go back to the status quo, because fundamentally there's no accountability and there isn't the right kind of regulation to make sure that systemically we're making progress. That's sort of my reflection in doing this work for a long time.
No, that's great. And I don't want to come back to the accountability and regulation point later for sure. I'll just move on to the next one. One of the issues that I think anyone who's entering this industry and thinking about it is that the difference and change of production cycles. So this is the World Resource Institute. I think they're being a bit generous, saying that traditionally there are only 2 cycles per year. But anyway, they've used that as a comparison, as a baseline. But in fast fashion, then you're looking at, in this case, they've said 50 cycles a year, and I think sometimes obviously less. But the ability to identify an item that will be attractive, to design it, produce it, get samples out, and then really bring it to the stores in an extremely quick time. And that puts a huge amount of pressure on supply chains to deliver. And of course, every time that happens, there's going to be the usual negotiation and price and quantity negotiations about how to get it and to make it at the right price for the retailer. Maxine, your book covers these things. Do you want to just sort of add something to this thought?
Yeah, first to just say I entirely agree with Aisha and her comments on the previous slide. I think just a little story to tell around these cycles, because it is so often presented by industry that this is somehow consumer driven, that these companies are just fulfilling unquenching consumer demand. And I think a story of why the fashion cycle and fashion season was actually first introduced. It was an economic tool that was created by Louis XIV, and it was a way to develop the French economy. So he had protectionist measures in place to develop French industry, and then invented, his economic minister invented the concept of the fashion season, so that there was this redundancy built in, that the court had to then be on trend for that next cycle. So I think just understanding that this has always been an economic driver, this industry is dismissed as something silly, girly, and that somehow it's the consumer's responsibility and the consumer's fault for this. It is very much an economic driver, certainly for the companies that are benefiting from this now endless cycle. And what I would say is this is the typical fast fashion is 50 cycles per year, but now we have even, what we call trash fashion, because it has to be distinguished from these 50 cycles per year, which is just tens of thousands of new products introduced every single day. So just some additional context to add to that slide.
It's really interesting, trash fashion. I hadn't heard that. Let's come back to that. And well, to that point then, I mean, one of the things I wanted to add into this was just the estimated massive increase in consumption and therefore resource consumption in the apparel industry. Presumably, again, we would just attribute this simply to this sort of a created demand by the businesses just driving product down their retail chains. Is that right, Maxine?
And I'd say also, Duncan, the increased reliance on fossil fuel simply makes the product very cheap. And so as you think about when we look at consumers across Europe or the US, the fact that, maybe you can't afford a home, you can't afford to have a retirement plan, but you can certainly afford reams and reams of fast-moving
Yeah.
consumer goods and clothes. And it's a way to sort of placate you into thinking that, everything is okay. So I think there's sort of mass economic trends for us to look at, but also this sort of resource consumption, we are not really paying for the cost of that resource consumption. And especially with the reliance and growing reliance on polyester, it's so cheap that it's very hard for even thoughtfully made brands, and Maxine has some experience with this, to thrive because it's too cheap with our reliance on fossil fuel. And to try and change that at the consumer end really simply isn't possible. We've seen lots of thoughtful brands and
Yeah.
nonprofits try it, but it's I think we're trying to tackle the wrong problem by making it putting the onus on the consumer.
It's interesting. It reminds me of that speech by Stanley Tucci in Devil Wears Prada, where he talks about cerulean. And a little known fact is that for a period of in the early 2000s, I was a contributing editor to a fashion and culture magazine in Hong Kong, and did attend quite a lot of fashion shows, not to write about the designs, I might add, but to write about the sort of culture of it. But it always reminds me of that speech where he says, "Oh, but she picks out cerulean, and eventually it's up here in haute couture, and then it makes its way all the way down, and that all the way down to sort of the retail racks." And of course, that model in a way has completely gone in some sense, and then now you can just pump them straight onto the racks. And the sort of old fashioned houses guiding what happens is less important. So from the investor's perspective, this overproduction and this demand-driven, supply-driven market creates, it's financially very rewarding. And so in order to bring investors greater information about it, various indices and transparency efforts have been done. One of them is the Fashion Transparency Act. When I'm teaching my students on sustainability and ask them to pick case studies, they'll often try and find the same sort of brands over and over again. And one of them they always pick, outside of Tesla, although less so now, I would say, is Patagonia. And so I always show those students that pick Patagonia this index that Patagonia sits actually as a kind of median in terms of transparency, which shocks a lot of them, because they're like, but surely Patagonia is the guiding star for all of us in everything. Maxine, do you have any thoughts about why Patagonia has this kind of, almost holier than thou image, but in this case sort of sits in the middle?
Sure. I think I'll circle it back to Aisha's opening comments, because I think that there is this desire always to have a brand that you can point to say they're doing it right. And so but for just all these other companies doing it like them, the industry would be a good one. And what that negates is actually this complete lack of regulatory environment, which would compel any of the companies, all of the companies listed here, to achieve a certain standard. So I think it really is almost it's a function of their own storytelling, and a function of the media environment really continuing to want to prop up examples of companies, and I'm not fill in any company. I'm not speaking for or against any of them. But it is this desire from the media to advance, a solution, and not really recognize the challenge that is really undergirding this entire industry and preventing, even a Patagonia from ultimately being able to achieve the progress that they even want to achieve.
Duncan, I have a lot of thoughts about Patagonia.
Go ahead.
As you know, they have now established a very different kind of ownership model as the family stepped down in order to spend all their profits towards climate impacts. But one of the questions that I often think about is they continue to overproduce, a lot of their fleece and jackets continue to have a lot of fossil fuel reliance. There is no talk in their sustainability messaging around living wages or fundamentally taking care of its most essential workers. And yet they have this halo of sustainability. And what that tells me is, well, one, we have a knowledge and education gap. And two, is the giving more than the taking here? Because if Patagonia really wanted to care about the climate crisis, should they not be producing less fossil fuel driven product and continue this race to the bottom and then take those profits and then invest in climate? And then finally, there's a justice lens to this, right? Because a lot of their investments when it comes to climate with their charity are focused on the global north. Yet a lot of the pollution and the exploitation with which their product is built is in the global south.
Yeah, yeah. And Sheila, transparency and lack of, I mean, your work on investigating supply chains and what you've done, and you're doing at Transparentum, can you just give us a sense of why you guys are doing investigation, why it takes so much time in order to find out exactly what is happening in supply chains? And therefore, because you're doing so much work on this, there is obviously a lack of transparency, even though some of these companies, obviously not the ones at the bottom, but even in the mid-tier, would hold out that they are being transparent.
Yeah, and the reason why our investigations are so challenging is because we're looking at kind of two sides of things, right? The first thing is that we're looking at the labor abuses. You spoke about Rana Plaza. I think two of the factories in that building had been certified before the whole building went down. So you would think, okay, that was a mistake. Surely we will fix the certification problem and the audits that underpin the certification so this doesn't happen. We all know that, audits are a mess, certifications are a mess. And that's why, the majority of work sites where we have uncovered issues have been certified by companies that supposedly looked at those same issues. So, one of the things that we see is that there are a lot of problems that we're able to uncover, without too much difficulty, but that should have been uncovered through corporate governance. That's not happening, which kind of brings us back to what Maxine said, and which I know that Aisha believes in too, since I've lobbied alongside with her for better governance. But then back to transparency, the other thing that we do is trace chains. When we're looking, so over the past, I guess, 2 or 3 years, we've had 3 investigations. One at we've had more than that, but one looking at the raw material level for apparel, then looking at tier 2 textile factories, and then tier 1 factories. So tier 1 factories, it's a bit easier to find, even if the buyers aren't disclosing them. There's other ways looking at, commerce data that we're able to trace those chains. Tier 2, it's extremely complicated. There are some companies that disclose to the tier 2 level, but not a lot. Looking at, trade data, you kind of have to go from, one country to another country, and then it's hard to say with, definity to these buyers that there are labor abuses, in your supply chain. Looking at the raw material level is, a whole different ball game, and the only way that we've been able to do that is by looking mainly through vertically integrated companies, or also if there are buyers or manufacturers that have kind of like specific programs where they're nominating farms. But it's very challenging, and it should be that traceability and transparency is the norm, because if a buyer does not know all of the different elements in their supply chain, how are they going to know where there are problems?
That's great. Thank you for explaining that. Can you remind me to come back to the issue of auditors and social audit? And what I want to do after we've just finished these slides is come back to this issue also of the gender lens that we've got to look at, because this is not a workforce that is diverse. This is a workforce that is heavily women as well. So this isn't just about, here are some universal approaches to it. There's some specifics here. So just the last few things. Firstly, I hate reading these bios at the beginning, so I always mess it up. But what I would really like is Aisha, and for you to tell us a bit more about Remake and also just start introducing this idea that this is not just about Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, and countries in Africa and Asia. This is also about what's happening in Europe and in the Americas.
Yeah, absolutely, Duncan. You know, what Sheila said was really important. Prior to founding Remake, I was with Better Work. We were, you know, the International Labor Organization essentially doing audits because we had recognized that private audits, there's a lot of corruption. It's a race to the bottom. It's pay to play. You know, as the ILO, we could certainly go in there. And one of the things in all those years that I realized is it's the fundamental business model of the way our industry is set up that causes these violations again and again. And what we keep thinking is it's a data problem, it's a transparency problem. Like as long as we can get better data, better reporting, but what we're not understanding is that the system is girded in setting up these types of human rights violations. So for example, you know, why is there excessive overtime and constant human rights abuses? Well, it's because of the way that the industry procures product. And that sort of brings us to, you know, the investigation that we did in Italy. A lot of our education is broad consumer-based education, as well as educating press and legislators. And often the myth is that, you know, all these problems when it comes to sweatshops are happening over there in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, and so one of the reasons why we've done a lot of investigations in downtown Los Angeles and in Prato, Italy, is to really debunk that myth and to recognize that there are sweatshops and really good factories everywhere. It's not an Asia problem, you know, but it really is about the fundamental business model.
No,
And covered in crypto is again this sort of race to the bottom of, you know, made in Italy has this halo, just like Patagonia does. But actually, there is a lot of modern day slavery and sweatshops in Italy, and the same is the case in California.
yeah, that's I can those who listen to this and have never been to LA. I live in downtown LA. I'm right there right now. Nobody knows what is going on at any time of the day, and that definitely includes me. A man was macheted the other day simply, and nobody knows what happened to the man and his machete. And that this is definitely, you know, it is a place, for example, for downtown LA where a lot of things are happening, and there's virtually no knowledge of what is going on. So these places exist in the West, and we got to recognize that. Maxine, your book. Now I'm going to admit that I've got it, but I haven't read it. I only got it recently, not for this, but for my course as well, to recommend it. But I did see that Bill McKibben recommended it, which if he says it's required reading, then it must be so. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the book and then the work that you're doing with the Institute?
Sure. So the book was really a way to, so prior to the New Standard Institute, my background is in law, as you had mentioned, but I had worked in a startup that was trying to do the right thing. A very different theory of change, walking into things to where I think we've all landed now. And so in knowing that I was going to, in the work that I'd done before, the company was called Zadie. We worked with supply chains in the United States. We knew exactly where our cotton farmer was. We knew exactly where our wool ranch was. We had pieced together kind of remaining suppliers within the United States that we could go, we could visit. We were a small team, and that was our way to really understand and intimately be connected to the supply chain that was producing our garments. But as I understood that even as we were growing, the fast fashion industry was far outpacing us. And I kind of took that step back to see that we need more structural change, that it wasn't going to be through just another, sustainable company. And so I knew that I felt very comfortable and confident about what was happening in US manufacturing, but I didn't know intimately. I read all the reports available, but really wanted to piece together in my own mind what was going on in the broader supply chain and why we are where we are. And so that is what Unraveled is. It is following your standard pair of jeans. So going to cotton fields, in Texas, to mills in China, going to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, back to the US, looking at Amazon distribution facilities, eventually to the waste processes in the United States, and then finally, ultimately in Ghana, looking at where the state of the secondhand industry. And yes, the subtitle is The Life and Death of a Garment. I wish it was what I had wanted it to be, which is how clothing explains our world, our world and our role in it. Because I think clothing is such a profound way that we are all, and I think all of our collective work on this panel is a living of that clothing really does get into our economic model. It explains history in a lot of ways, what's gone wrong in history, and also then presents what can be a successful future. So that's the book. And then the work that we're doing now really is trying to address things at the New Standard Institute on the regulatory front, looking at both the environmental and labor impacts, and specifically, how do we address in big consuming jurisdictions, so in New York State, in California, how do we ensure that in the consuming jurisdictions that there is accountability for the companies selling the product throughout their supply chain? And that's what we're advancing with the Fashion Act in both New York and California.
How are the acts progressing? Because they're ambitious.
They are ambitious.
And why not?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and as you were describing the as Sheila, you were describing why it should be very basic to have a supply chain. What was playing in my head was the trade associations testifying to how just impossible and crazy that is, to suggest that would even be possible. So that's what I have playing in my mind. And I think, and hopefully we'll get into this conversation, there is definitely a growing awareness that this industry is problematic. And at the same time, there is the trade associations. And what I would say that is deeply problematic is even companies that say that they care about human rights, that say that they have science-based targets on the climate side, and say that they are doing chemical monitoring, they are still paying trade associations that are actively opposing this bill, which is only putting to law what had been these voluntary agreements, and the companies saying they are doing these things. And so I think that there is a lot of interest coming from the grassroots. There's a lot of interest coming from legislators to address this, and the industry has a powerful voice. And I think we need to get more organizations on board to get to really push back against this industry narrative. And I think the industry itself, if you are a company that says you care about these things and are claiming these things, then you need to be a part of the regulatory solutions, and you certainly should not have membership in an organization that is opposing them.
Yeah.
You know, Duncan, one of the things that's very beautiful about Maxine's book, encourage everyone to read it, on Audible, you could do that as well, is that it really humanizes this workforce. And for us at Remake, that has been really a key lever of change, whether it's educating and getting unlikely bedfellows to care about these issues, or when it comes to advocacy and policy change, because this industry has benefited so much from keeping the workforce invisible. Who is she? What is her life like? Who are these 70 million, mostly women of color, that power this industry that's worth $2.5 trillion, and yet she can't put 3 meals on a table?
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to start there. And, to Maxine's point, we have some practice with this in passing the Garment Worker Protection Act here in California, where one of the things that we found was big fashion, came after us, essentially calling it a job killer bill, that somehow by workers making minimum wage rather than piece rate, it was going to kill the industry. But what we did see was a lot of much smaller SMEs, sustainable brands, hundreds of them lock arms with us as the labor to help make the bill into law. So I do think there is a groundswell of thoughtful, tinier brands. It's just this industry is so consolidated and there's a few players, and this includes luxury, high street, and ultra fast fashion that really control the narrative and most of the market share.
Then what you've said, both of you, I mean, because I'm following your work, it's laughable when large brands who are very profitable come and say, "Oh, you're killing the industry," when the industry is supply driven, and so the industry is controlling what is being bought and what is being produced. So for them, they're just going to roll with it, and I think that's what you can't help but smile at the irony when they say that, because it wouldn't change anything if the margins if the workers' wages were increased, because the market is being created simply by the companies themselves, and they will just still keep pushing it. So finally, on my slides, Sheila, if you can talk a bit about, firstly, again, going to Maxine and Aisha's point about the lack of transparency, and you just raised already, and where there's a failure of regulation and enforcement. But also what we want to do is whilst talking about also your work as well, is segue eventually into actually how workers are being treated and what you're actually finding, quite specifically.
Yeah, so this is for tier 2 textile factories in Taiwan. We found workers from Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. We were looking at ILO, International Labor Organization, indicators of forced labor. There was deception about job terms, working conditions, debt bondage, extremely high recruitment fees, more than we found in any other investigation, intimidation and threats to control worker behavior. It's been a bit more challenging to trace the chains because it is tier 2 factories. So we kind of look at, for the most part, where are those exports going to, and then into which tier 1 factories, and then where are those tier 1 factories exporting to. Then we've been approaching those buyers. And one argument that we're trying to make, it's the kind of thing that if you go to a grocery store because you want to get the croissants, and you know that the croissants are made ethically, but that grocery store also is selling bagels, and you know that those bagels are made with forced labor, wouldn't you kind of have some obligation, maybe not go to that store, or try to make sure that those bagels aren't also being made by forced labor? I was the one that chose croissants and bagels because I'm obsessed with both foods. So even if we cannot directly trace all of those chains, from our evidence, or if the companies can't confirm it, we do still see that there are sourcing from suppliers directly or indirectly that are still using forced labor. And then obviously this gives kind of economic advantages, right, along the entire chain, which they're benefiting from. When you're looking at regulation, so Section 307 of the Tariff Act, the U.S. import ban, kind of was implemented quite robustly. Then it slowed down. Now there's a question mark. We think that maybe it will be implemented even more. There's been, I think, 2 WROs issued since the beginning of the Trump administration. And there's questions about what remediation will look like, because if remediation won't be robust, then I don't think that many CSOs will be submitting petitions. But that's effective. We know that the forced labor regulation is, well, it's supposed to come online. I think maybe it's next year, but I guess everything in the EU right now is a question mark. And then the CSDDD, or the omnibus, right? We saw that
Just explain what CSDDD is. And what I actually want you to do is, at some point, we're going to go back and explain about the tiering of supply chains, because I think a lot of people, it's, for the 4 of us, we can talk about tiering all day long, but for a lot of people, they're like, well, what actually is happening? But just go back and explain what CSDDD is, and what we expected out of it as activists, and what we're kind of getting.
Yeah. So the CSDDD, it stands for Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive from the European Union. I think that it was maybe was it 2023 or 2024 when it was adopted. But there was,
I think it was 24, wasn't it?
Was it 2024? It was negotiations ongoing for a long time. Obviously, the end result was weaker than a lot of us wanted, but it still seemed fairly strong. And then I guess it was maybe the fall of 2024, maybe, when they decided to open it up again, a simplification process, which I think activists might choose a different word. What happened earlier this week is that the European Council gave their recent position on what's now called the Omnibus Bill, which is a way to kind of adjust both the CSDDD, which has been passed, and then also the CSRD, which is about these kind of metrics that different companies have to report on. One of the many ways in which the European Council's kind of rubber stamp on the member states' recent position will water it down. And again, this is ongoing, is that instead of companies having to, well, first of all, kind of increasing the threshold, so it's only very big companies that have to do this, but instead of tracing their chains or conducting due diligence on the tier 1 level, or throughout their supply chain, they can stop at the tier 1 level unless there is kind of specific information saying that there are problems deeper in the tiers. So it means, for what we have looked at in Taiwan, this wouldn't even really be in scope for multinational companies to look at, because it is tier 2.
Right,
And
the
I think the reason
tiering.
that's
Sorry.
really important, Duncan, is if you look across the 30 years of this industry, where we've seen some of the worst disasters like Rana Plaza, often the first line of defense for companies is to say, oh, it was illegally subcontracted. We didn't even know we were there. And so, a lot of the sunshine and focus is on tier 1 factories. And so if you're not going to look at tier 2 or tier 3, you're often not going to focus on where some of the worst human rights abuses sit.
Just a story to
Great.
add to that made this point very clear to me. I was at a trade association conference, and I think this was back when maybe those trade associations thought I would be friendlier to them. And there was an anonymous survey that was done of the chief sustainability officers in the room. And the question was, what are you most concerned about? And I don't remember the 4 choices, but the one that was predominantly that won by far and away was, there's going to be some disaster in some factory in a place that we didn't even know we were operating. And I think kind of speaking to that, what I understood, just in terms of this supply chain, Sheila has been speaking about the challenges of going deeper. The reason why the cut and sew, right? And this was the case with Rana Plaza, how they could be traced back is that's where the tags are actually, the name brands are actually sewn in. So there's evidence because the brand is there. But once you remove back, they get to have plausible deniability on anything. And they choose to do that, obviously, so they can have plausible deniability. But I think, I just wanted to share that story.
That's really interesting. Just to explain that a bit more, is that when I was running my own previous NGO, Liberty Shared, we did an anti-money laundering typology on Rana Plaza, and one of the key aspects was the fact that the name tags were all found in amongst the rubble, and we then did the sort of typology back to show who had been involved, and one of those factories was. We had been contacted by the charitable foundation of one of those retailers and said, we'd like to donate to your work, particularly on this anti-money laundering thing. And I said, well, I think you should just slow down a bit, because your retailer is actually involved in this. You do realize in one of these typologies, and no, we didn't know that at all, but that's good work. And I said, no, I think you need to be a bit more careful, because your name tag is there, and you need to think about this as a corporate risk. And what fascinated me was that it took a while of discussion for the penny to drop, that this was actually a problem that they were involved with and they had contributed to. It wasn't something they could resolve by simply doing charitable work. And if you're not familiar with tiering, anyone who's listening to this, is that the retailer is obviously going to. The first thing I ever did in my life after university was manufacture stuff in China, and I manufactured all the baseball caps and scarves for the Euro '96 football cup, which was like tens of thousands of baseball caps, all in China. The contracts that exist between corporations in these tierings are minimal at best. And so if you're thinking about, well, what's in these contracts as they buy and sell between them, they can be very, very simple contracts, and they fade away to almost nothing by the end of it. They're just phone calls. Can you deliver this in this quantity and in this quality? Because they're very used to it. And a lot of it is more about design, thread count, and whether, whatever it might be, baseball caps, whether there's a buckram or not, and so forth. But the reality is that these tierings, as they go concentrically round, they are not, or levels down, they are not hard and fast, long negotiated contracts between them. They are very quickly done, and that's the only reason you can have a fast fashion cycle. So, Sheila, just quickly, how difficult is it to actually uncover this in an investigation? You talked a bit about trade data and so forth, but really specifically, if we're talking about understanding, I mean, on the cover of your on the cover of this document is, and I'm going to stop showing this now, is this lady working? We know that there is, as Aisha said, as you've all said, that there's a gender bias in the nature of the workers. When you're talking about gender violence, the use of that as a coercive tool, how do you get to understand what is actually happening in these factories, all these tiers down, when there is very little kind of structure within the tiers other than the orders themselves?
You mean, so you're asking about how do we identify gender-based?
Yeah. Or anything, but gender-based, we'll take gender-based violence as an
Well,
example.
I can say that gender-based violence has been one of the hardest things for us to identify. And part of it is because, so I'm always surprised by Lesotho and kind of, the investigation that uncovered all of this gender-based violence and how it led to a worker-driven social responsibility project, because I spoke to one of the people who was working on it, and they said they weren't even asking about it. It just kind of came up. But my experience is that it's really hard to identify it because it doesn't come up, right? It's something that often people are shameful about, or depending on the level of violence, it can be something that's a bit normalized, right? So like, why are you asking these questions? Yeah, the complication for that is that you really need to have kind of long, trusting relationships with the people who you're asking questions of, and that can be hard when you're trying to go in and conduct an investigation and not be seen, right, by factory management. So in one of our investigations in India, in tier 1 factories, we found gender-based violence, and this was against, girls and, young women, just kind of, horrific stories that will make, your skin crawl. When we were in Mauritius, we had heard about a lot of stories, especially in one factory, about gender-based violence. And we were speaking with workers. This investigation also took place during COVID, so there was like extra, complications. And we weren't able to get specific enough information about anything that came out. So, we couldn't really pursue that further.
And let's just be clear for anyone who's listening, is that something like gender-based violence, sexual harassment, rape, the threat of rape, these are already crimes. These are horrendous and serious offenses against the person. So there's no issue that this is not law that needs to be enforced. The first thing that I think people don't understand is that women are afraid. And why wouldn't they be? Because the people who are committing these crimes are the very people supervising them on the shop floor. So there is no escape from this situation. I often find when one talking about this is that people are kind of incredulous. Oh, why can't they report it? Why don't they come forward? And could you explain a bit more about the environment in which people are working in these factories that creates this obviously fear to report and to discuss?
Yeah, and that's exactly right, right. So not just for gender-based violence, but just for other issues like, okay, well, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just tell anyone? And it's it really depends also on the kind of situation that you're looking at, right? So when we're talking about what we found in India several years ago, these were young women or girls, right, under the age of 18, who were coming from different areas. So internal migrants from India. There were some, wasn't a recruitment agency, it was like a training agency, right? So there was, like confiscation of certain documents. I believe on our website, it has all the specific information. So they knew they kind of had to stay there. They had like a few year contract. And they weren't allowed to leave before that contract. So first you have this, vulnerable population, already you're, poor in India, you are female, you're told, you're away from your family, your support network. The only time you could leave the factory is through having like supervised visits, right? So, someone of authority is with you, so you can't just necessarily go make a phone call to your mom and explain what's happening. And you have this contract for a few years, how are you supposed to get out of it? So that's kind of one example. Another example is when you're talking about recruitment fees, which, Duncan and I could talk about all day. I probably have spoken with you for all day about it. If, so this is not exclusively, but often when you're talking about, transnational labor migration, if a worker pays high recruitment fees in their home country, often going into debt, under the expectation that they're going to be making, a decent wage where they will be able to pay it off quickly, also make some money, to live on, to send some home. And then they go to this other country, the terms and conditions are completely different. They're not making enough money, so they can't get out of debt. But then how can they leave? Because they're under this debt, right? Perhaps they could leave the factory and work somewhere else, but then because in so many countries, visas are tied to work, if they leave, then they will be undocumented, and then there'll be a whole host of other problems. So there's, and then of course you also have actual intimidation, like over intimidation by factory owners. So you have kind of, cultural ways, you have overt intimidation, and then kind of structural ways in how the labor market is created. But on the other side of things, it's just, yes, rape is illegal. Underpayment of wages is illegal. A lot of these things are illegal. And when we write our reports, and we're increasingly working with governments, we list out all the things that, passport confiscation in certain instances as well, to say, look, these are just basic laws that you need to enforce. You need to have a robust, labor inspectorate. So yeah, it shouldn't be this is some kind of secret thing that, only a few organizations are able to uncover. Shouldn't exist in the first place. There should be structures in place that uncover it, and there are already existing laws that should be able to address it. But Duncan, I have a question for the group, if I'm able to.
Yeah, go ahead.
To do that. I've been hearing a bit, but not directly. So that's why I wanted to talk to all of you about this rise of like contingent suppliers. So with all these tariff disruptions, we've been hearing that brands are increasingly using these contingent suppliers in countries that aren't affected by tariffs. But because of that, then they're bypassing any due diligence standards that they had applied to their primary supplier relationships. And I'm worried that this is going to become like the force majeure of the COVID era, just kind of a convenient excuse to abandon established standards. So I didn't know if any of you had heard about that, or kind of what work is being done to address that.
I'll let Aisha, I haven't specifically heard of that, but to build on what you said, and the tariffs have certainly, is demonstrating again the systemic flaws, the systemic issues that are at play, because again, companies writ large are cutting back, are demanding price cuts, all of these things that we know purchasing practices and the price that they're willing to pay is a systemic driver of, so many of these issues, and that there is enormous I think price pressure is too gentle of a term. There are these enormously impactful price cuts being demanded from the companies all the way down with these tariffs. So yeah, it's you can't say it's force majeure as a lawyer, because that's definitely not force majeure. That's a tariff. So but certainly in how the companies are responding, it's just demonstrating yet again the structural problems that are at play.
Sheila, I think for me, I think back to COVID in terms of what we're seeing now, where with the tariffs, the workers are always the ones bearing the most risk because you're wanting to keep prices as low as possible. And I think we will see an uptick of, consumer prices going up as well. But contingent suppliers in many ways is similar to tier two, right? It sort of darkened the supply chain and, have vulnerable workers where you have fewer protections in order to keep the business model as is. And we saw this in the pandemic in terms of workers bore the brunt of the unpredictability, the inability to ship goods, in terms of mass wage theft. There are still cases of wage theft where workers are still owed money from that time period. And I think similarly, what we are seeing with the unpredictability and not knowing, which tariff, what percentage, is that workers again bear that risk, both in terms of wage theft and also working longer hours. And the darker the supply chain, the easier for those two forces to be at play. I think that's something else, is the connective tissue to some of this that we don't think about. The reason you see a lot of consistent wage theft and excessive working hours is because that's the business model that the system is predicated on. And in times of crisis, we see both of those things going up. And then just going back to the prior note about, gender-based violence and why it is so difficult. In many ways, it also speaks to why social auditing is fundamentally broken. Think about supervisors and up are often men. A lot of the private sector auditors are men. They enter a factory, sit in an air-conditioned conference room, review some papers. It may be easy for you to detect whether there's child labor or not, but when it comes to the sensitivity of, is there a forced labor situation, our passports taken away, and you know this, Duncan, better than I, or is there gender-based violence? Like, we also have some solutions that we know that work, whether it's thinking about binding agreements like Dindigal, or having worker-based committees that are women-led and unionized factories, where you have the voice and ears of people who have trust of the workforce that are able to escalate these concerns. So again, we have solutions. The question is, how much does the industry actually want this to bubble up to address it? Because in many ways, the way that the business model is set up leads to a lot of the gender-based violence, right? If you have punishing production targets and a man walking up and down an assembly line shouting at you to work faster and for less and less money, that is the perfect pressure cooker to create some of the GBVH conditions that we find in factory settings. So it also goes back to sort of how we place orders, how quickly we try to move goods, how fast the output targets are, and then the power dynamics at play that Sheila articulated so well.
No,
Just
go ahead.
to build on that a little, just an anecdote to share that helped this become clear to me. Sheila, you were speaking about working with local governments to make sure that the laws that are on their books are actually enforced. And I was speaking for research for the book. I was speaking to a major multinational brand operating in Bangladesh, and I was asking, what work are they doing to ensure that there are both regulations in place and that those regulations are being enforced to advance the work that they claimed to care about. And the response back to me was like, oh, we would never get involved with government. Like, that's so neocolonial of you to even suggest that we would do that. And I was like, it's neocolonial of me to suggest that you advance laws that would protect garment workers that you are actively exploiting, but it is not neocolonial of you to be in this country right now profiting off of these workers. Like, what? So I just it helped me, I don't know, made me very clear of like the role that brands do and do not play, and are the hindrance that they are playing in can play, and what they could be doing to actually help level the playing field and get out of this race to the bottom, which is also like a country right now. If you're a government in this export producing, utilizing this export producing industry, if you start raising your standards, you're putting your sector at a competitive disadvantage in a world in which there isn't regulation, and that is deeply problematic. So the companies that are benefiting the most from this have a really critical role to play in ensuring that the standards are raised across the board so that we get out of this race to the bottom. And right now, they're not playing an effective role.
Just to both your points, for attendees, one of the reasons that the laws aren't enforced is simply there is no law enforcement looking at this kind of thing. So globally, there are very, very few, if no, real was one criminal investigation against, which led to a settlement against a multinational, not in the apparel industry. So these crimes aren't being enforced because there is nobody really looking at them, no one investigating, and there's no experience in law enforcement to do this kind of work. So it's maybe limited really to perhaps the US, yes, only. Just to this point about social auditors, my basic problems with them are they're unregulated, they're not professional, they're being paid by the company, which, yeah, sure, financial auditors are also paid by the company, but financial auditors, in a sense, have a slightly more, they're in a regulated situation where they're professionals, they have a professional accountancy authority, as it were, and so there is at least and they have massive indemnities. And as Arthur Anderson found out when they fraudulently audited Enron, you can disappear off the face of the earth, even though you're the third or whatever it was, largest accountancy firm on the planet. That can happen. Social auditors, no one knows their names, they're in and out, no one knows who they are. Tell us, Sheila, your experience with them. You do contact them, I think, and have conversations with them. What are they like? Who are these people?
What are they like? I mean, I've had lovely conversations with them when it's one-on-one, right? And a lot of them kind of understand the problems, but I think we just have different approaches on what companies, which suppliers should be certified, whether even if there are problems. And I think there's also questions about engagement, right? So some auditors will say, well, or some certifiers will say, well, we still wanted to keep them, to have a certification because it helps us engage with them. And we're all about engagement, right? I don't think any of us will say that, that a buyer should cut and run from a supplier. So, engagement is important. But just to add to your list about the problems of audits, and we put out a report a couple of years ago called Hidden Harm, giving a lot of stories about the problems with audits. We weren't even looking into problems with audits in a lot of our investigations. Those stories just bubbled up, and then we realized, oh, that this is huge. Then we put out a report about it, and now, of course, we do ask, and then we hear a lot more. But there's widespread fraud, deception, document falsification. Audits are quite shallow. The process isn't transparent. The results aren't transparent. We talked about complex supply chains. There's also complex auditing chains, which also fracture responsibility. And then there's no legal liability for auditors when they miss violations. But, NGOs and academics have been talking about this for several years. Some companies and investors that we talk to also acknowledge these limitations. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, who kind of implements, Section 307 of the Tariff Act, also understand that there are these problems. They're more vocal about that in the Biden administration, but I think that the leadership there still knows. And in the CSDDD, in the preamble, it also kind of referenced problems with audit reliability. So I think it's known that there are problems, but most companies still rely on these as a main compliance mechanism. And then investors feel comfortable accepting these clean audit reports as, proof of responsible sourcing. So it's a system that I think everyone knows is broken, but it's convenient. And that's why it persists. And with that, I have to run to.
You have to jump off. Just give me a couple of ideas on prevention. What do we need to do on prevention?
Unions, worker voice, worker power.
Anything else? Enforcement, regulation, investor behavior, anything?
I mean, honestly, I think that is the most important thing. We need unions or legitimate worker representations who can, help identify the problems, prevent the problems, speak out. I mean, ideally, these worker-driven social responsibility programs are the best. Unfortunately, that's also crowding out, the work that governments are supposed to be doing. But it does seem like those are the most effective ways to do it. That's kind of the in audit, that you can assume that there are going to be problems in a supply chain if there is not legitimate worker representation. And legitimate worker representation is going to be the thing that will prevent the big problems from occurring, because they'll be able to address them when they're small. And of course, this is something that governments have to support. The private sector has to support too. And the civil society too, can as well, especially when there aren't robust unions, right? To help facilitate other kinds of worker representation, to educate workers about, what are the laws, what are their rights, how do they, identify problems, how do they help file complaints?
Thank you very much, Sheila. You jump off. I'll have a last couple of minutes with Aisha and Maxine to go through the same thing. Good to see you.
So,
Bye.
Duncan, just chiming in on what Sheila said, part of the problem with audits also is, I think the most important thing to recognize is that the customer is the brand. The customer is not workers. When we were at Better Work, it's, well, we need to make the audit reports available to unions, available to workers, because the question is, once you have the data of the violations, what's happening with it? Are you using it as an early warning signal as a brand, simply to cut and run, or to see what problems there are that you might address? Or are you using it to build worker power? Who's the customer for this data? And I think for a very long time, whether investigations or auditing, the primary customer has been the brand and not the worker. And in our industry, when the primary customer is the worker, that's where you've seen the most amount of progress, whether it comes to binding agreements, whether it comes to worker-led legislation. When it's bottom up instead of top down, that's where we've seen actual inroads and success.
Oh, that's really important. And we should, when we do the summary of this conversation, but we'll make sure that we add, obviously, links to Dindigul agreements and so forth, so people can go to those. Maxine, sort of final thoughts on prevention.
Yeah, I'll build on the auditing conversation because I think it's a good one. And you had mentioned, Duncan, how financial auditing, it is paid for by the company, but it is somehow more useful. And I think it is somehow more useful because that company, if something comes up, they are they can be liable. And that's what is the market difference in this industry and in this aspect. And so, so when it is the brand that is the customer, as Aisha says, then it's the end of the road. That the brand being the customer, we could, once there is laws and enforcement in place, then those audits, that auditing system, can become more like the financial auditing system, where there is transparency around them, where they are bubbling up issues that are actually, companies are going to take action on them because they could ultimately be held liable for something that goes wrong. And so I definitely believe in the unions as a very powerful lever. And I think global coordination on worker voice is also just super important, because we see, you know, companies are going to where there is structurally less worker voice. So we have to both have work to have worker voice and use that collective worker voice to ensure that there are laws in place where there is going to be some enforcement of these companies and regulation around them.
Thanks very much, both of you. That's a good place to end. To any viewers and listeners, follow these speakers' work. It's amazing stuff. And there's a lot coming, I know, from knowing all three of them. And I thank you very much for joining me. I will catch up with you both separately. Thanks very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.